All right, so I travel the world discussing what happens at the intersection of hip-hop culture and architecture. And what I've discovered is that black culture, when combined with what I'll call otherness, usually creates something or results in something that is very innovative. And before we talk about hip-hop architecture, I want to give you a few examples of how hip-hop has influenced different products in a series of images that I'll call before and after hip-hop. So here's the Eames chair before hip-hop, and here's the Eames chair after hip-hop, where an artist put speakers and a turntable in the ottoman of that Eames chair. It's Mona Lisa before hip-hop. It's Mona Lisa after hip-hop, where an artist had an exhibit at a Detroit museum that was focused on painting rappers in the same medium and lighting as Mona Lisa. It's Timberland boots before hip-hop, a boot that was worn by construction workers, contractors who needed a steel toe, something to protect their feet. And here's Timberland boots after hip-hop. I don't need to change the image. I think I better mark that one down. That was a good one. All right, so Timberland boots after hip-hop. Once Timberland boots became synonymous with hip-hop, it was almost blasphemy to have dirty Timberlands. No one would wear them on a construction site. Me and myself, I've thrown away a couple of pairs of Timberland boots once they received scuffs. NBA shorts before hip-hop. It's a mistake waiting to happen. Here's NBA shorts after hip-hop, where if you watch ESPN's 30 for 30, the Fab Five, who always talked about the music they listened to before going on a court, and they're also known for wearing longer shorts, the black socks and the black shoes. But even by today's standards, their shorts might be a little short. Then we have the turntable before hip-hop. We all know what's next. And then we have headphones before hip-hop, and we know what's next, right? Beats. Got a president of the United States before hip-hop. And we all know who's next. No, it was Bill Clinton. No, you got it right. It was President Obama, who used hip-hop not once but twice to mobilize first-time voters to win the White House. Hip-hop was very involved with that movement politically. And then hip-hop got out of politics, and we have... And here's architecture before hip-hop. All right, this is one of the most iconic images of architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. So this is architecture before hip-hop, and I'm here to talk about what architecture is after hip-hop. So the idea of combining architecture and black music is not a new concept. This was something discussed almost 100 years ago by an architect, Le Corbusier. He wanted to combine not hip-hop, again, this was around the 1920s, but he wanted to combine jazz music and architecture during the Harlem Renaissance. He met Josephine Baker, who is pretty much the face of the Harlem Renaissance. And they met on a cruise ship. I think I'll let Biz Marquis tell the story. He might tell a little better than me.
Have you ever met a girl that you tried to date, but a year to make love, she wanted you to wait? Let me tell you a story of my situation. I was talking to this girl from the U.S. nation. The way that I met her was on tour at a concert. She had long hair and a short miniskirt. I just got on.
And I hope y'all know the song.
I was walking through the crowd, and guess who I met? I whispered in her ear, come to the picture booth so I can ask you some questions to see if you're 100 proof. I asked her name, she said blah, blah, blah. She had 9, 10 pairs and a very big bra. I took a couple of flicks and she was enthused. I said, how do you like the show? She said I was very amused. I started throwing bass, she started throwing.
All right, so this is y'all part to have some fun right here.
She acted kind of strange.
I think we all know the chorus.
She said, no, I don't. I only have a friend. Come on. I'm not even going for it. Here's what I'm going.
Here we go. You got what I need. Come on. Louder, don't whisper. You say he's just a friend. Oh, baby, you got what I need. All right. All right, it's not y'all show. Okay, so that song perfectly describes Corbu when he met Josephine Baker. And when Biz Markie is singing, "You Got What I Need," it's exactly what Corbu was saying about Josephine Baker and the Harlem Renaissance. If you go to Le Corbusier's foundation, you can read some of the letters that he wrote Josephine Baker while married. He actually wrote a letter to his mother about his love for Josephine Baker. He eventually started to stalk Josephine Baker as he showed up in New York a couple of times. And this is a photo from when they first met. You can see Josephine Baker trying to get away from him as he tries to get what he needs. But exactly what was it that he needed? This is a quote from Corbu where he said, "Negro music has touched America because it is the melody of the soul joined with the rhythm of the machine. It is in two-part time, tears in the heart, movement of the legs, torso, arms, and head. The music of the era of construction, innovating. It floods the body and heart, it floods the USA, and it floods the world." He would continue by saying, "Jazz is more advanced than the architecture. And if architecture were at the point reached by jazz, it would be an incredible spectacle." So, what exactly is he saying? He was captivated by the jazz musicians' mastery of the tools of creating music, where a number of them could not read music, but they can get together with no formal training on how to play instruments and create sounds that had never been created before. And he wondered if architects will ever master the tools of architecture and construction the way that jazz musicians had mastered the tools of music. So this idea of combining black music and architecture is not something totally new. And I often call Corbu the forefather of hip hop. Now, this is not taking any credit away from the black and brown brothers and sisters who actually created hip hop, but this is making Corbu and the architecture profession responsible for their part in creating the ghettos across the country, which would eventually birth hip hop culture. In his many plans and schemes and visions, Le Corbusier had plans for the Center of Paris, which I won't go that much into, but I'll pull out 5 points from his City of Tomorrow, where he wanted to liberate the working class Paris citizens by creating a new center of the city. He said that he wanted to provide these translucent prisms of glass, immediate access to employment, vast lawns which would surround the residents, under the shade of trees, and provide them with clean air and no noise. What he was doing was describing utopia. He believed that his architecture could liberate the working class, and if people would take part in what he called this machine, he could churn out better citizens. And Paris did not implement his plans because they were unsure of the social ramifications of that architecture on the inhabitants. But there was a man named Robert Moses. Robert Moses, when developing the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York, he went to Corbu's plan for the Center of Paris. But he did something I call the worst remix in history. Instead of taking the things that Corbu cited as necessary for such an architecture to be a success, Robert Moses used none of those items. And he used the one item that was heavily criticized, the physical architecture itself, the towers in a park. From those towers, hip hop would eventually be born. The birthplace of hip hop is 1520 Sedgwick Avenue. These towers were built at the suggestion of Robert Moses and are based on Corbu's model, towers in a park. So hip hop architecture. Hip hop, I argue, is partially a result of bad architecture. And now hip hop has come of an age where it's creating its own architecture. And that architecture is based on the 5 elements of hip hop: the DJ, the MC, the B-boy, the graffiti artist, and that 5th element is knowledge. So if we look at rap or the MC, how can we combine that MC with architecture? I call rap modernism's post-occupancy evaluation. Had to make it sound fancy for people to listen to it. As we design spaces and places for people, whether it's a hospital, a school, we oftentimes go back and talk to the individuals. If it's a school, we'll talk to the students. We'll talk to the teachers or professors, even the janitorial staff and engineers, to see how successful we were with that project and use those as lessons learned as we move on to that next school. That's something that has not happened with public housing. Corbu's idea of towers in a park became the typology that would describe or define how many African Americans would spend their time here in the US in public housing. So again, RAP is modernism's post-occupancy evaluation. RAP is this unsolicited, very true evaluation of the successes and failures of architecture. Song after song describes what happened.
Broken glass everywhere, people pissing on the stage, you know they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise, got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with the tow truck repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
So The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five is a stark contrast to what Corbu thought he was providing for the citizens in Paris, or maybe what Robert Moses thought he was providing while building the Cross Bronx Expressway. So when Corbu talked about these prisms of glass, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five start off with broken glass everywhere. Clean air and no noise. They said they can't take the smell and they can't take the noise. This is something that is in total contrast of what we as architects, urban planners, decision makers, what we believe we are providing for communities. I think hip hop represents this urban reality, or this reality of urban renewal. And Paris did not implement that plan because, again, they knew that they might have a few issues with the inhabitants of those spaces. And this was a critique by a magazine of Corbu's plan for the center of Paris, where they said, it's the next generation really destined to pass its existence in these immense geometrical barracks, living in standardized mass production houses with mass production furniture. Their games, and by that I mean their recreations, are all based on the same model. Poor creatures. What will they become in the midst of all this dreadful speed, this organization, this terrible uniformity? You guys read the rest of the quote. But the main point here is that this critique is what I call a prediction of hip hop, about 50 years before hip hop came into existence. So this quote is from the 1920s, where hip hop was born in 1974. The critique of Corbu's plan ends with, here's enough to discuss one forever with standardization and to make one long for disorder. This is what they thought would happen to the inhabitants of those spaces. And I argue this is exactly what happened when that architecture was created here in the US. Another element, can we look at breakdancing? And I call this another fancy name, the structural stability of breakdancing. And these were sketches drawn by an artist, her name is Florian Nicole, where she was simply drawing it for a logo. And I thought, how can we use it more? Can we look at the structural stability of breakers? All right. Is there an opportunity there where we can understand or study the forces that are being exerted on individuals' wrists, their head, the torsion within their body? And can we take those geometric studies and now start to create furniture that is based on the friezes by B-boys and B-girls? And then I said, can we take that furniture and can it be just as flexible as the breakers themselves? Can it go from being a chair to now being a coffee table? Within a lot of hip-hop communities, we grew up with items that serve more than one purpose. What was once a milk crate eventually became a chair to play Nintendo, carried records at one point for DJs, and once it became battered, we usually cut the bottom out and it became our basketball room. So how can our products that we produce have those same multiple features? Here's another element. Can we look at graffiti as a space generator? This was a prison in Berlin, and the prison, once closed, was taken over by graffiti artists who basically went and bombed this entire prison and did it so beautifully that it became an art museum. This idea of creating space is now starting to show up in architecture all around the world. This is in Detroit. This is a parking garage called The Z by Dan Gilbert, where Dan Gilbert invited a number of graffiti artists or muralists. Some people don't like being called graffiti artists. There are muralists who came in and were given a floor in the parking structure. And then you have the architect Zay Belling. Zay Belling said, can we take graffiti, something that is temporal, something that's on a wall, it can go away at one point if it is painted over or the wall is taken down. And he wanted to move graffiti from a temporal point to something that is more permanent, right? So this graffiti is one of the main structural components of a house that he calls the Hive. Now this is arguably one of the first pieces of hip hop architecture, one of the first physical items with an actual client. And it has a number of individuals debating its authenticity. But can we take graffiti and move from that extrusion, right? This extrusion of the graffiti plane, and now can we work with graffiti artists and teach those individuals who do tags? Can we show them how to use 3D software, 3D programs, so they can take some of their geometric shapes that always have implications of a third dimension, whether it's through bevels or drop shadows? Can we give them the tools that they need to allow them to create functional or tangible items? This is a study I did working with an artist to create his tag as a reception desk. Then we also have hip hop artists themselves who are creating architecture, like Pharrell Williams. Pharrell Williams has a book that's titled Places and Spaces That I've Been, which is based on him meeting people as he traveled and the architecture or projects that he's been involved with. This project is called the Pharrell Williams Resource Center, where he is working to provide youth with the resources that he thought he may have needed as a youth growing up. And then there's a project, the Universal Hip Hop Museum, which I think is the defining project of hip hop architecture. This is a project that I've been working on for the past 2 years with artists such as LL Cool J, Ice-T, Curtis Blow, the Sugar Hill Gang. The Universal Hip Hop Museum is in the Bronx, and I conducted a nationwide series of events that I called Design Ciphers to make the language more relatable to the hip hop community. Instead of calling them design charrettes, we called it ciphers. And we teamed with Autodesk and Microsoft to put these design ciphers on across the country. Our first one was in the Bronx, where, again, Curtis Blow being the chairman for the Universal Hip Hop Museum, we invited hip hop artists from around the country, high school students, politicians there in the Bronx, where we worked for 3 days, elbow to elbow, coming up with the concept for the Universal Hip Hop Museum. Here's the Sugar Hill Gang. So it's not just any hip hop artists, these are the artists who created hip hop. They are now creating the museum or leading the creation of the museum themselves, which is a unique project for a museum. There's no interpretation of their art going on here. They're still alive, and they are the individuals designing their own museum and exhibits. Also brought minority practitioners. These are my friends from the National Organization of Minority Architects, who are able to sit with their icons, people that they look up to, people that we grew up with, and create architecture. Throughout this process, we broke up into teams, came up with one-word descriptions of what the museum should be. We also came up with a number of ideas about programmatic experiences. So what types of exhibits should we have? And that resulted in the creation of the first vision for the museum. This was at the Bronx County Courthouse. It's a courthouse that's been closed for some time. One of the challenges we face is that we could not change the exterior facade of the building. And being hip hop, a lot of people said that's the first thing we wanted to do. As soon as they said that we can't change it, we thought about ideas where we can change it. And the idea that we came up with was to use lights. How can we project videos or photos on the museum and totally change it after being told that we couldn't? So these were some images I created with students following that design cipher. And then we started to talk about an app where anybody could be able to walk by and change the color or project a photo. Everybody would have the ability to play a role in changing the facade of this museum. We talked about trains. How can we bring subways into the museum to allow visitors to experience graffiti in some of the original formats? So this was an idea where you can come to a kiosk and you could draw on that kiosk and have your graffiti projected onto a subway. And these were great conversations because we were having these conversations with Microsoft by our side. So it was impossible to come up with an idea that sounded unrealistic. And then one of the main takeaways for me from that project was that hip-hop artists sometimes feel as if their lyrics are not heard. And this was an exhibit we came up with where artists would have their lyrics there and visitors will be able to come and touch certain words and have those words come to life, or definitions will be given by the artists themselves in their voice. So we can explain some of those double entendres that you may hear and may have taken the wrong way, allow artists to decipher those lyrics. And then we also moved to this idea that the museum needs to be accessible. And New York is not a cheap trip. So how can we create a mobile experience where we can take this museum around to different individuals? And that became what we call Hip-Optimus Prime. It's this 18-wheeler that travels the country and opens up and allows people to experience some of the museum exhibits. So that is the Universal Hip Hop Museum. It is a 720,000 square foot development, of which the museum is approximately 65,000 square feet, and it's the first phase. And it is scheduled to be open in the year 2022. Here's an image from the backside, from the Harlem River, and from the air. So a lot of hip hop's pioneers were born in public housing. And as I said before, rap music is the post-occupancy evaluation of modernism. A key component to this project is the public housing. So the two towers you see is low-income public housing that the museum is providing for residents. Going through this entire process, lots of great things happening, me traveling across the country, talking about hip-hop and architecture, working on a museum with some of the pioneers of hip-hop. My wife and I went through a great experience of her becoming pregnant with our son, MJ3. This was one of the happiest moments of my life that quickly turned into one of the saddest points of my life. So my wife went 9 months, and 2 days after our due date, our son passed away. So before he was born. And that was, again, a pretty troubling point, but it made me go a little deeper into my research. It was something I could say hip-hop honestly saved me. So being able to dive deeper and now think, how can I provide this experience for other children? When we were expecting MJ3, my goal was to pass all this information on to my son, and that didn't happen. So I created what's called the Hip Hop Architecture Camp. And the Hip Hop Architecture Camp is a national initiative that is funded by Autodesk with the curriculum created by myself. We travel across the country presenting many of the concepts I showed you just now. The goal is to introduce underrepresented communities to architecture and urban planning, but using hip hop as that catalyst. So far, we've been featured on ESPN, The Undefeated, a spot on the Today Show, and countless other magazines and publications where our kids' work is being seen. And the three things that we want to provide is an identity for those youth. We want to provide them with the sense of community where not only can the students, but also their parents come, and then provide them with a purpose. We have an album, a mixtape that we're releasing. So each city that we visited, not only did they learn how to create architecture, create 3D models and 3D print, they also made songs to talk about their community and some of their architectural designs. Each one of the groups also worked together to put out a challenge. We call it the Build It Up Challenge, where they came up with ideas and concepts for their communities and challenged their favorite artists to build their concepts. And if you can't understand anything that I've said today, or some of the lyrics from the artists, I challenge you to listen to Vanilla Ice, Ice Ice Baby, that I won't play here. But he did have 3 words, and outside of that, he probably was not successful. But the first 3 words in this first song was stop, collaborate, and listen. That's what I challenge all of you, no matter what profession you're in. I challenge you to stop doing what you're doing, collaborate with the people who may be the unpaying end users of your thoughts, your ideas, or your projects, and listen to some of their ideas. Thank you.